Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on where you are in the different time zones. We are going to start the session. So welcome, all of you. And today I think it's my pleasure to open this session at day 2 of CSW66 on men and unpaid care work, global perspectives, COVID and beyond. This session is co-organized by MISA, MenEngage Alliance South Asia, Azad Foundation, and Breakthrough India. The session will present the programmatic experiences of various organizations, contexts during the COVID and post-COVID from across the globe on working with men and boys towards building more gender just families and communities and building care economies to contribute to achieve women's economic empowerment in the changing world. You will have to excuse my background because I'm sitting in dark with a power cut from my end. So excuse me for that. Before we start, I think just to help us set the ground for our today's discussion, let's watch a very short video. Let me give a brief introduction to the video that we are going to see. It is called Garbi Baharbi, meaning home as well as outside. In this vox pop, women share their experiences of working at home and outside. The video talks about double burden syndrome, a culture where both men and women feel that the family, childcare and household duties are primarily a woman's responsibility, and men mostly help, and it is based on their own convenience. So let's have a look at a very short video, and then we'll go into starting the session. Thank you so much.
के बाद फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल तो आई जस्ट वेक अप माई बेबी, मैं उसको उठाती हूँ, उसको मैं फीड कराती हूँ पहले, फिर उसके बाद मैं जस्ट अपना बात लेती हूँ, अपना फ्रेश होती हूँ, उसके बाद मैं उसको तैयार करती हूँ प्रॉपर, ठीक है। उसके बाद फिर मैं अपना ब्रेकफास्ट वगैरह रेडी करके मैं ऑफिस आ जाती हूँ। ऑफिस में पूरा दिन काम करने के बाद मैं घर जाती हूँ। उसके बाद मैं जाने के बाद सबके लिए नाश्ता बनाती हूँ, चाय या नाश्ता एंड ऑल थिंग्स। उसके बाद मैं बेबी के लिए एक प्री डिनर्स, एक स्नैक्स तैयार करती हूँ, जो उसको फीड कराती हूँ। उसके बाद मैं डिनर तैयार करती हूँ, जो कि होल फैमिली को फिर खिलाती हूँ। उसके बाद मैं अपने बेबी को डिनर करवाती हूँ। उसके बाद उसकी मैं मालिश करती हूँ और उसके बाद उसको मैं फीड कराती हूँ। देन आई हैव टाइम टू गेट स्लीप अराउंड 12 और 1।
चैलेंजेस तो हमारे लिए रोज ही होता है वैसे वर्किंग वुमन के लिए, क्योंकि घर पे भी देखना होता है, बाहर भी करना होता है। तो हाँ, तो हम लोग 8 बजे पहुंचते हैं रात को घर, तो फिर उस टाइम बहुत टायर्ड हो जाते हैं। तो हम लोग खाना भी बनाना होता है, बच्चे को भी देखना होता है, अपने हस्बैंड को भी देखना, लंच डिनर भी देखना होता है। तो वो बहुत टायरिंग हो जाता है उनके लिए होल डे का। आई डोंट थिंक सो कोई भी हाउसवाइफ आजकल की डेट में होती है, बहुत कम होती है, रेयर होती है। तो एवरीबडी इज़ वर्किंग नाउ डेज, सो हमें मिलजुल के अपने घर में काम करना चाहिए, तो एक पे बर्डन नहीं आएगा। सब इक्वली काम करेंगे ना, तो सबके लिए अच्छा है।
बहुत मतलब बिजी हो जाते हैं। उसके बाद ये काम जो है ना, अब इतना शेड्यूल इतना बिजी है कि इंसान जो है अपने काम में इतना व्यस्त है। उसके बाद फिर टाइम जब देखते हैं तो बोलते हैं कि अब घर पे चलना है, खाना वगैरह बनाना है, बर्तन धुलना है, ये है वो है। अब वहाँ की टेंशन हो जाती है हम लोगों को।
बहुत से फैमिलीज में इस तरीके का सपोर्ट नहीं मिल पाता है कि वो आगे जाएं या जॉब करें किसी भी फील्ड में, तो ये ज़्यादा प्रॉब्लम्स हो जाती है उसमें। जैसे वर्किंग भी आ गया, हम जो काम करके जाते हैं, ऑफिस से काम करके जाएं, वहाँ पे भी करना पड़े, तो ये बर्डन हो जाता है उनके लिए।
कुछ हस्बैंड जो होते हैं हेल्प करते हैं, कुछ जो होते हैं नहीं करते हैं। अब उनको आदत सी पड़ जाती है।
सुबह जो होता है, हम लोग मॉर्निंग जब आते हैं तो हस्बैंड के लिए इतने सपोर्टेबल नहीं हैं, तो प्रॉपर हमें अपना वर्क स्टेशन पे आना होता है, तो हमें प्रॉपर तैयारी करनी होती है अपनी तरफ से।
समटाइम ही ऑब्वियसली ही हेल्प मी, और काम में हेल्प करवाते हैं, कभी कभार नहीं भी करवाते हैं, बिकॉज ही इज़ ऑल्सो वर्किंग एंड ही इज़ वर्किंग इन अ वेरी हैवी वर्कलोड एनवायरनमेंट, सो ही इज़ ऑल्सो टायर्ड। समटाइम ही इज़ नॉट एबल टू हेल्प मी आउट।
हस्बैंड भी मेरे काफ़ी सपोर्ट करते हैं। अगर उनका थोड़ा सा लेट या ऑफ होता है तो मेरी हेल्प कर देते हैं, जैसे कि ब्रेकफास्ट निकाल के देना किसी को, या अगर मैं बिजी हूँ तो दूसरे भी हेल्प कर देते हैं।
बच्चे अब तो बड़े हो गए हैं, तो अब खुद से बच्चे अपने आप केयर करते हैं। तो छोटे थे तो भाई हम ही लोगों को केयर करना पड़ता था। मैं शॉप पे कम मतलब आती थी, बच्चों को केयर ज़्यादा करती थी।
नहीं, दिक्कत होती है मगर क्या करें, मेहनत तो करना पड़ेगा। मेहनत करेंगे तभी आगे बढ़ेंगे ना, मेहनत नहीं करेंगे तो आगे कहाँ। अब थोड़ा बहुत दिक्कत और दुख तकलीफ तो लगा रहेगा। माय मदर इन लॉ इज देयर टू टेक केयर ऑफ हिम ऑल द टाइम।
मेरा जो एक्चुअली हॉबी था, मैं फुटबॉल खेलती थी और एक्चुअली बहुत ज़्यादा था, मतलब इतना ज़्यादा इंटरेस्ट था कि, लेकिन इसी टाइम के वजह से मैं ये शौक़ जो है अपना नहीं पूरा कर सकी। तो मैं चाहती हूँ कि मेरा बेटा करे, मेरे बच्चे करें। जो शौक़ हमने पूरा नहीं किया, मेरा बच्चे करें।
नहीं, मुझे कुछ नहीं, बस काम के अलावा कुछ नहीं पसंद है। अगर थोड़ा बहुत मोबाइल ले देते हैं तो वही गाना सुनते हैं, इसके अलावा कुछ नहीं।
I want to learn so many things as my hobby. I want to learn Kathak. It's my very previous hobby. I want to learn swimming. I want to also join some courses for enhance my career skills. So many things I have to do. I want to do, but I don't have any time, so I have to compromise.
Right. I hope you, I'm not sure whether you enjoyed it, but let's have a discussion on that with our panel of speakers. And let me introduce our moderator today for the session, Unpaid Parallel. He is the executive director at White Ribbon. He's a gender-based violence prevention specialist with 20 years experience in the non-profit sector, with expertise in gender equality, human rights, HIV/AIDS, LGBTQ plus advocacy, community development, and multi-sectoral partnerships. He's also the co-chair of the board of directors of Global MenEngage Alliance and is founding member of the North American MenEngage Network. Umberto has a degree in sociology, political science, and Portuguese from the University of Toronto, and is a graduate of the Emerging Leaders Program, Leadership and Nonprofit Management from the York University School of Business. So let me invite Umberto from here onwards, take on the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sumita, for that introduction, and welcome to you and to everybody in the audience to this discussion that I think will be really fantastic. So first of all, our thanks to Breakthrough India, to MenEngage South Asia, and to the Azad Foundation for organizing this event and for bringing us all together. We appreciate that very much. And what a fantastic video from Breakthrough. Thank you so much for putting that together. I found it very enlightening. It's always really good to see the impact of these issues on individuals' lives. And I think the video showed a really great series of personal accounts of what unequal division of care work can do to women, in particular, to women's lives and prospects for career development and so much more. So thank you for that video, and I encourage all of you to support it and to promote it through your networks as well. So let's get this session started because we have lots to talk about. And so just recap that this session will address a much needed but still emerging issue, that is the engaging men in transforming gender norms and within the home as relating to care and household work. We'll also highlight the pertinence of this issue in multi-country contexts, while opening the discussion to experience sharing by organizations from across the world. And there will be opportunities for members of the audience to participate throughout. So feel free to add your comments, your questions, to the chat box along the way so we can address them during the discussion, the questions and answer section of this event. On a global scale, at least 16.4 billion hours a day are spent on unpaid care work, the equivalent to 2 billion people working 8 hours a day. It is primarily women who engage in such unpaid care work, and this system systematically denies them opportunities to access education and livelihoods, leaving them vulnerable to violence that impacts well-being, a pattern of which has exacerbated during the COVID-19 pandemic. These statistics are underpinned by restrictive gender norms, which classify women as compassionate caregivers and men as leaders and providers. As an example, the weekly average time spent by men and women on total work, both paid and unpaid in India, is shown to be 48 hours and 62 hours respectively, according to the India 1998-1999 National Time Use surveys. Women therefore spend 28% more time on work than men do in total. Women spend almost 9 hours per day on work as opposed to 6.8 a day by men. If we apply the International Labour Organization average of 48 hours a week, women's time is highly stretched and in excess of the stipulated maximum, while men are within the limits of that norm. In Bangladesh, as another example, women engage in 6.3 hours of unpaid care work per day out of a total work time of 15.3 hours, which is 41% of their total work time. On the other hand, men spend 1.1 hours per day on unpaid care work, only 7% of their total work time of 15.3 hours. Similarly, in India, women spend an average of 5.1 hours a day on household and other unpaid care work, while men only spend 24 hours on the same. Although I've shared some statistics from a regional context, I have no doubt that similar inequities and differences exist all over the world, in fact. So women get much less personal or leisure time a day and less time to sleep and rest as a result. And we know that this all leads to detrimental effects on women's health, prosperity, empowerment, career options and advancements, and so much more. And that's why we're here today, to have a closer look at these issues, look at the experiences within the local context, and to take a look at best practices and recommendations on what we can do to change this around. So I have the privilege of welcoming 4 distinguished speakers, and they're fantastic. They're experts in these areas of work, and I am sure you will enjoy hearing from them. So first, I have Dr. Sapale Kotergoda, who joins us from Sri Lanka. She's an academic, a women's rights activist, and director of programs at Women's Economic Rights. She's also part of Women and Media Collective. Her research revolves around women in the informal sector, women's unpaid care work, women migrant workers, sexual and reproductive health and rights, gender in disasters, as well as women in the media and politics. We're also joined by Nikki van der Gaag, who's an independent gender consultant, a senior fellow at Institute Pramondo, and until January 2019, she was the director of gender justice and women's rights at Oxfam, Great Britain. She has authored many books and reports on feminists and men, including the State of the World's Girls and State of the World's Fathers reports. We're also joined by Desmond Lunga, who is a longstanding activist and ally and advocate in Africa. He's currently the team leader, a co-founder of Men and Boys for Gender Equality. He provides coordination to the Botswana MenEngage Network and has served as chairperson of MenEngage Africa. And finally, we will hear from Shrinivas Rao, who is a feminist social worker and trainer with many years of grassroots experience working on citizen leadership and participatory local self-governance. He has implemented some innovative participatory city planning and leadership development programs in urban contexts. Shrinivas works closely with grassroots leaders for initiatives such as Men for Gender Justice and feminist leadership programs, and has been interested in leadership building and institutional development process. So let's get going, and starting with the first round of our presentations and discussion, which will focus on the key contexts and challenges of unpaid care work from regional perspectives and the need to engage men and boys. So we're going to first hear from Dr. Sapali. Dr. Sapali, welcome. So I have a question for you to get us started. The COVID-19 pandemic has intensified the deeply gendered, undervalued, and unrecognized burden of unpaid care work in South Asia. What programmatic and policy challenges arise in attempts to address this issue?
Thank you very much. Thank you also for inviting me to be on this panel. And I think it goes without saying that the COVID pandemic was one of the most serious disasters that we in South Asia had to face, and along with the rest of the world. I want to go back a little bit to give you a picture of some of what happened during that time in terms of our daily lives. In Sri Lanka, beginning 2020, as lockdowns came into force, we had never had this kind of lockdowns before, and I'm sure in many countries it was the same. The reality of not being able to leave the house, of having to depend on somewhat erratic deliveries by lorries of staples such as rice or vegetables, this reality actually slowly sunk in. It took some months before reports, sometimes via WhatsApp, email, occasionally in the mainstream media, reports of incidents of domestic violence started to come in. By 2021, reports of these incidents were being prepared by women's organizations and by some few government health officers. Even so, there were people who denied that it was not that much of an issue in Sri Lanka. And one of the issues that the pandemic brought to the fore was that of intensifying gendered and unequal power relations within the home. And most often, such violence stems, of course, we know that such violence stems from social norms that require women to take the bulk of the work that has to be done in the home, and for the care of the family. These duties are, of course, shown as part of women's innate nurturing and caring traits. Many still seek to argue that men are not capable of such activities. And I think this is why these conversations that we're having now on engaging men and boys and women and men on these topics is really important. Now, I think these attitudes are also reflected at the national level in terms of, for example, the National Labour Force Survey, that in Sri Lanka, we say women's labour force participation is half that of men, 33.9% compared to 66.1%. So an estimated 73% of women are categorized as not in the labour force. So why are they not in the labour force? Because they are engaged in housework. And most concerning is the fact that the care work in the home by women is not recognized as work of economic value. So and historically, I think, hence it's socially, this buffers patriarchal attitudes and actions against women, because there is this perception, it's an overwhelming perception at the family level, and where we compare the work that brings in income in hand and the work that is done in the home, that women are doing nothing at home. And taking up the theme, what I'm going to do today is to show little bits of the work that my organization has been doing to highlight this issue of recognizing unpaid care work, and the strategies that we are developing and sharing on bringing in men and boys, and recognition of the work that women and girls and women do. So taking up the theme, which actually came about with Diane Nelson's heartbreaking work on unpaid care work, which is recognize, reduce, and redistribute unpaid care work. We have Women and Media Collective have been intervening in different fora. And one was to engage school children in this discussion. So we invited children from between ages 8 and 16 to send us their artwork, you know, with crayon or paint on the theme, what I think of care work. These submissions were actually very revealing on how children perceive the women and men working at home. And I want to show you one. It is addressing the theme overall. I looked at this picture, and the theme is redistribute unpaid care work. Okay, so here we have the family in the kitchen, and we see there's a man as well. And many of these pictures that the children had sent actually had men doing certain kinds of work. There were some that showed men also engaged in child minding. This is a lovely way of putting it across, I think. And when we had said this, given this, opened up this competition, one of the school teachers from a school where children had submitted, he said that this theme made him think more about the work in the home. And he said he encouraged the students in his art class to speak about this, and that for him it was a new area. It was almost a revelation. You know, Women and Media, during this period, we had drafted policy briefs on the situation of Sri Lankan overseas migrant workers, many women. We drafted, because we needed to push for their return to be expedited, we drafted a policy brief on women workers in the informal sector, who along with men were severely affected by the pandemic and the lockdowns. And we used social media to bring a focus on the importance of sharing work within the home. We produced and posted video clips focusing on specific religio-cultural days of the year. Vesak for Buddhists, Deepavali for Hindus, Ramazan for Muslims, Christmas for Christians. Each video clip highlighted best practices of men and boys working together with women and girls to bring more meaning to such celebrations. So let me just try and, okay.
வருஷம் 365 நாளும் வீட்டு வேலைகளை செய்தாலும் நிறைய பேர் நினைப்பாங்க நோன்பு மாசத்துல வீட்டு வேலைகள் மிச்சம் குறைவெண்டு. ஆனா அப்படி இல்லை. நோன்பு பிடிக்கிறவங்க சாப்பாடை சாப்பிடாட்டியும் வீட்டில் உள்ளவங்களுக்கு செய்ய வேண்டிய பல வேலைகளை செய்ய வேண்டித்தானே இருக்கு.
நோன்பு திறக்கும் போது மாலை நேரத்தில் முழு குடும்பத்துக்கும் தேவையான உணவு வகைகளை தயாரிக்கின்ற.
Dr. Sapale, it looks like the internet may not be cooperating. Perhaps you can add the link to the video in the chat, and our audience members can view it at a later time. And I think your time is up as well, and maybe you can share, if you still had a few more points to make, maybe you can share it in your second presentation, if that's okay. But so appreciate you bringing the context of your work in Sri Lanka, and definitely the increase in domestic violence and the impact on women's lives and children's lives is something that we've seen around the globe as well. So thank you for bringing that perspective. And as we look to raise the new generation of children, it's really important that we also consider the messages, the examples that kids are learning at home from the interaction of their parents, and from that unequal distribution of care in the family. So thank you so much for your work, and I look forward to learning more about it in your second round. So wonderful. We're going to now pass the floor to Nikki. And so Nikki, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And so our question to you is, exploring deeper into the context of unpaid care work in the global north, what impact has this had on the lives of women and prospects for women's economic empowerment?
Thank you very much for the questions, Umberto, and thank you to Ranushi and colleagues from MenEngage Alliance South Asia, to Azad Foundation and Breakthrough for inviting me to be on this distinguished panel. I'm really enjoying it already, and I thought the video was wonderful. It was great that we're starting a session on men and unpaid care with women's voices. I think that's fantastic. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about your question, and I think I was also going to talk a little bit about some of the key global issues and a little bit about State of the World's Fathers. Is that right, Umberto? Did you deal with those three all at once?
Sounds good. Go for it. Thank you.
So I want to start by saying that sitting here in Europe, I find it really hard to think about care at the moment without thinking about Ukraine, where militarized masculinities and a lack of care is so much in evidence. While at the same time, women and men have come together to care and support each other in the face of violent aggression. Not the first time this has happened in the world at all, but it's very much in the forefront of our minds here in Europe, at least. The situation makes it so clear we have to try and build a world, not only where everyone cares, but where war is no longer possible, where an ethic of care for ourselves, for each other, for our families, communities, societies, and our planet is paramount. So looking at unpaid care more specifically, I just want to make a couple of kind of general points. One is that this is not a global south, global north issue. There's no country in the world where women and men share unpaid care and domestic work in the home equally, although it does vary very much from country to country and region to region. And Diane Elson, I think Dr. Sipali mentioned, the recognize, reduce, redistribute principles apply to all of us. Secondly, the fact that women and girls still do the majority of the care work and are therefore seen as the carers and see themselves as the carers actually often, while men see themselves as providers and are seen as providers, clearly holds women back in terms of economic empowerment, and changing this is one of the keys to gender equality. But the issue of care is much more than just the redistribution of care between women and men in the home, important though this is. It's about a wider reframing of our societies, our economies, what feminists have long called the care economy, in order to build a more careful world. The business of care has to become everybody's business, I think. So for this to happen, what needs to change? And, you know, again, something that feminists have been working on for such a long time, and I think gradually organizations that work on men and gender equality are coming into this arena more fully. And it's really, we're going to talk later about collaboration, but that collaboration is really, really key. So in 2019, feminist organizations came together for the Generation Equality Forum in Mexico City, and they've developed something called the Mexico City Strategic Vision Framework, which outlines 6 policy needs around caregiving. I'm not going to go into any great detail, but one was around data, one was around laws and policies, including universal access to quality public care services, guaranteeing living wages and access to social protection. We often forget that bit. Increasing public investment in the care economy, parental and family leave, and then pension care credits for time spent out of the labour force. So I've been doing work recently with HelpAge and certainly thinking about older women and what older women lose out on in terms of their caring responsibilities over many years is really important. So this wider context was something I think we've increasingly recognised as the Men Care campaigners, Promundo, and the organisations who brought out the 4 State of the World's Fathers reports that I helped to co-author. And in the last report, we called it Structural Solutions to Achieving Equality in Care Work. We had 7 actions for a more caring world, many of which actually mirrored the Mexico City Forum recommendations. So again, just briefly, putting in place national care policies and campaigns, providing equal, job-protected, fully paid parental leave for all parents as a national policy, and we know that in the US it's still not there. Design and expand social protection programs to redistribute care equally between women and men, while keeping a focus on the needs of rights of women and girls, and I'll come back to that in my second part. Transforming in the health sector and the institutions there to promote fathers' involvement from the prenatal period through birth and childhood. Promoting an ethic of male care in schools and the media, kind of really fighting against the idea that boys don't care and that, you know, that then leads to the idea of men as providers and women as carers. Changing workplace conditions, culture and policies to support workers' caregiving, and mandating those changes in national legislation. And that includes things like subsidized quality childcare. It doesn't just benefit women, it benefits everybody. And then finally, holding male political leaders, and I would say female political leaders, although there are fewer of them, accountable for their support of care policies while advocating for women's equality in political leadership. And all this context of power and patriarchy seems to me to be absolutely key here when we're thinking about unpaid care. It's definitely not just about programs, although programs are really important. It's about that wider piece. So I suspect I'm nearly out of time. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the other panelists and also from you, the participants. I know I can see your list of names. You've got extensive experience and expertise in this area. So I shall leave it there, and I've got things I'll come back to Humberto in my second part of the question. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Nikki, for your insights, and thank you for starting your presentation with that reminder that that we are all working towards a caring world that's freed of conflict and war, and our solidarity goes out to the people of Ukraine and people everywhere who are impacted in living through conflict and wars. So thank you for that reminder, and reminders too that the equal distribution of care is a benefit to all of us, and that we must work both on individual change, addressing stereotypes and norms, but also working towards policy change as well. So thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing further insights in our second round of questions. And so with that said, we're going to turn it over to Shrinivas. And hello, Shrinivas, welcome to our event. And here's a question for you. Share with us some insights and experiences from your work on the ground, working with men and boys and addressing unpaid care work. And in particular, what has been some highlights from the past 2 years because of COVID?
Okay, so I think it would be hard to not speak about COVID and the impact that it has created on humanity. But I think when I look at it, we look at it as part of our work and our engagement in communities elsewhere also. I think it was also a crisis of masculinity. Now, why I am saying this, because see, what happened during COVID is both men and women, both have lost jobs. But somehow when men have lost jobs, their masculinity is not able to accept that, that the vulnerability of men. So in India, I think a lot of you have seen the kind of lockdown and the way a lot of unorganized laborers were forced to walk miles to reach their homes. And somewhere, these are the images that were, I think, circulated around the world. So I think this whole notion of men being providers is being exposed during the lockdown. So if I just want to give you a little statistics that, out of 120 millions who have lost their jobs during COVID, 75%, which accounts for 92 million jobs, were lost in informal sector, as per the Oxfam's study in 2020. But if you look at an Indian context, 90% women are in informal workforce. So you can understand that not many women have lost their jobs. Also, unfortunately, COVID situation also, a lot of majority of men have not learned how to handle failures. So what we have seen during COVID is there has been increased control, demands, because a lot of them were inside homes. So a lot of men do not have the habit to remain in their houses. So I think their demand for various kinds of, their needs. And of course, we have seen a lot of violence. So data suggests violence, a high rate of violence, and violation of rights. We have seen child marriages or distress call from children towards early child marriages have increased. We also know that compared to men, 7% of whom lost jobs, 37% of women lost theirs also. So in terms of if you look at it, how disproportionate impact that COVID had on both men and women, and how men dealt with it and how women dealt with it. And then as far as learning goes, there is also, we know that there is a digital divide where we have seen that women have lesser access to internet or mobile smartphones. So that is also a context which needs to be looked at. So as part of our work, Azad, because Azad works on livelihoods with dignity for resource poor women and women's entry into non-traditional livelihood. So part of our work, it is important to engage with men. Because if women have to go out and work, men have to also take responsibility at home. So I think a lot of our work with young men and boys is around understanding the gender and patriarchy and the structure, gender-based violence, understanding of unpaid care work, and women and work, especially around non-traditional livelihoods. So, but I think if I look at what is the silver lining in terms of working with the young boys and men, is that we have also seen, despite all that, somewhere the young men, especially young men and boys, have also taken a lot of responsibilities at home. The group that we have worked with, we have seen their ability to engage and in unpaid care work. Also, I think it's very important when you are looking at the entire work with men. I think a couple of things which are very important. One is family is a very important, I think, a cornerstone of any intervention. One has to work with men and boys. I think family is a very integral part of it. How one engages with the family in terms of changing gender norms is equally important. So we have seen that as part of our work, that when we work with young minds, because as you say, catch them early. So if one start working with the adolescent, young men, young boys and men, there is a hope that they are engaged, they are looking at and understanding how their fathers have dealt with their life and how they don't want to live in the same way. So I think some of our work also indicates that if one engages at the family level, and there is also a process of collectivization, one can see that man is capable of changing. So I rest my case here, but I'll be happy to engage.
Thank you so much, Shrinivas, and change is what we're looking for, and it's so inspiring to see that the young men in particular that you're working with are demonstrating greater interest and greater commitment to change in this. So I know our younger generations are headed in the right direction, but it's so important for us to continue to work through dismantling those harmful norms and stereotypes that patriarchy has imposed on us as individuals and families and collective, and that so many men continue to subscribe to in their day-to-day lives, that sense of loss and their inability to deal constructively with that pain, with that loss, with that grief, and instead resort to control and dominance and violence. So thank you for those important reminders, and again, I look forward to our continued discussion in part 2. And so let's turn it over to Desmond now. Hello, Desmond. Nice to see you. Thank you for joining us. So here's a question for you. What are the key programmatic challenges in addressing the root causes of unpaid care work in the African context?
Thank you very much. And thank you for the organizations that invited me to be part of this panel. I think it's a great honor. And I think having had most of the speakers share about the challenging times, the COVID-19 challenging times that we had to encounter. It was the same here in Africa, and very sad during the time of lockdown, where we expected the same men and boys to be with their family, to be protectors and be productive and help with the care work during the pandemic. But we also, like the rest of the world, reported a lot of incidents of gender-based violence during that time. But maybe trying to zoom into your question that talks to unpaid care work. In Africa, we find ourselves at a point where about 65% of women are always involved in care work. They spend an average of about 4 to 5 hours a day doing care work, which goes against the women empowerment movement, where we want to see women earning education, women being able to occupy spaces and leadership within political parties, between government or within different corporate companies. So this is a challenge like the rest of the world. And COVID has also put a scar to the movement. But I think as MenEngage Africa, as organizations in Africa that have come up with different programs that try and address these issues. We have programs such as the Men Care program, which is a global fatherhood campaign that engages men to become better parents, to become better caregivers. And we have programs such as Men in the Kitchen, where we are educating men how to cook and encouraging them to go back home and help with the care work within their home spaces. However, like you've highlighted, there are challenges to this work that we've been doing in Africa. And most of the challenges that we've encountered are the fact that, in our African culture, there's always been that gender role and division of labor within the house, where we believe that men are the primary caregivers and providers. So they need to either go and work and bring in money, and women need to remain at home. So through our programming, we've encountered challenges where people are saying, no, it's not my space as a man in the kitchen, or I don't want my family, extended family, to see me in the kitchen because as an African man, it does not look well. It's not what I'm supposed to do. So we had to challenge those norms. We had to engage with men and women and try and ensure that we have programs that talk to such issues. We've also looked at challenges in our own African culture, where the Men Care program educates and encourages men to be in the delivery room, to support their partner during pregnancy, to support their partner when they deliver, to support their partner with the care work. And you'd find that in parts of Africa, including Botswana, where there is what we call botsetsi, which is a period where a woman delivers the child and the man is not supposed to be part of that process because it's culturally believed that maybe the man might affect the child's immune system and different African beliefs that are there. So we had to challenge such cultural beliefs, be able to sit down with the custodians of culture to explain the advantage of programs such as the Men Care program, the advantage of men being in the delivery room, and the advantage of men being able to be caregivers to their kids, and share some of the research that we've seen that shows that when men are involved in the care and upbringing of their children, they're less likely to be violent to their kids or to their partners. So these are some of the programs that we've been able to engage and say, how can we be able to advocate even for policy change? Because we've also realized that there is need for policy change. There is need for government and organizations to be part of the process, one by government ensuring that hospitals allow men to be part of the delivery room, or companies that employ people to have care centers where, as a father, if I'm able to bring my child with to work and allow my wife either to go and get an education or my wife to be able to go to work. So these are policies that as a network, we continue to challenge and encourage different companies and corporates to be able to change so that we can be able to help women in terms of issues of care work. And some of the challenges that we've realized also is within the culture that as a man, if you impregnate a woman, you would need to pay a fine for impregnating that woman. And if you're not able to pay, then you're not allowed to be part of the child's upbringing. And so because of such cultures, we found ourselves having men interested in being part of the caregiving, but not able because either they don't have money or they are denied that access. So those are some of the challenges that we've been able to see and work with. But overall, I would also want to highlight the fact that with engaging men, we've learned that urbanization has also created a challenge, because as we try and engage with men, you would find that most men leave their rural villages to go to cities where they go and look for jobs, and they're not likely living with their partners, and their partners are left in their villages to do all the care work alone without their partners. And besides that, we've also encountered challenges around programming that show that men are very mobile. And so because they are mobile, if you want to enroll them in a program like such as the Men Care program, you'd find that they probably would be there for 2 weeks and they lose their jobs because of COVID or something, and they move to another village or another town where they can be able to look for jobs. So in a nutshell, those are some of the challenges that we've encountered in Africa around programming for men. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Desmond, and what great illustrations of how these issues impact people's lives in the African context in particular, as you described. And I think one of the key takeaways for me too is the importance of again, just as in the case of Shrinivas, of us working on individual behavior, attitudinal change, but also looking at the impacts of patriarchy, centuries of patriarchy on norms, on stereotypes, on traditional longstanding practices, and the need for us to transform those as well, and to use a holistic and ecological approach by not looking just at the individual change, but working with healthcare providers, with employers, with policymakers to turn these issues around and to address them and prevent them from continuing. So thank you so much for your insight. So this brings to an end the first round of our questions and discussions, and I thank all the participants for your comments and your questions in the chat box, and I encourage you to continue sharing those with us. And so just some highlights from those comments. Philoma reminded us of the importance of listening to women's experiences and women's voices, as was the case in the breakthrough video, and to share with us how important it is for women to have time for their own personal and professional development in some cases as well. Some of the women talked about wanting to engage in further learning and opportunities to develop their career trajectories as well, which, if we think about, is also beneficial to the rest of the family and to men as well and within the family. And also the point that you made, Philoma, that war places the additional burden of providing security for the family on the shoulders of the woman as the men are away fighting. And we've seen really heartbreaking examples of that in the latest conflict in Ukraine, and the role, the hardships that we see women taking on and caring for their kids and their families as the men continue to be involved in the war. And of course, we know the horrible, terrible impacts of war on men's lives as well. And Karen, thank you for bringing that insight, that personal insight, that just as you are participating in this webinar, you are also caring for a sick child. And that's a perfect example of that. That role that women traditionally play in caring for kids, and it's a role that disproportionately is put on the shoulders of women. And so we wish you well and your child well. And yeah, so those are some of the insights. And also there was a question from Vadehi around policy. And so how can policymakers use time use surveys to ensure inclusion of unpaid care work in their policy formulation? Can an existing policy accommodate this aspect of work and labor, or does an entirely new policy process need to be initiated? So for those of you on the panel who are working on policy development advocacy, perhaps you can address this question briefly during your second question, which we are now going to move to, if that's okay with everybody. So the second round then takes us into what are the lessons learned from working with men to address unpaid care work. So what are some of the insights that we have gathered as a result of doing this work in the field? And we're going to start with this time with Shrinivas. So Shrinivas, welcome again. And here's a question for you. How should these challenges discussed earlier inform the strategies and approaches that we must take to achieve women's economic empowerment, and in particular with work with men and boys, specifically in COVID, post-COVID contexts?
Right. So I think you would agree, and we all of us agree, that COVID has changed the world forever. I mean, in many ways. So I think it also is very important to note that COVID has also generated new kinds of demands. So I think this work from home scenario and virtual offices and all that, I think there is a greater responsibility lies on men to be looking at recognizing, reducing, and redistributing the care work. But I think it is also important that somewhere when we as a social activist and civil society and various other stakeholders also somewhere need our responsibility, I mean, as a part of strategy, is to that care, highlight that care work needs more importance, and this recognition that it is valuable and it has a value. Other important aspect that we have seen, and we as part of our work, some of our insight is that it is important to create role models, because in communities, if you have role models who are there and who are leading that charge, leading that campaign, it basically visibilizes that it is possible, that there is absolutely possible to alter the norms, change the norms, and there is a possibility of more men folks joining and valuing this. So similarly, I think there has to be also a lot of emphasis. We have been all working, I know, there's a lot of emphasis on changing social norms, and a lot of strategies are there in place to also address that. But I think continue to work on this, where more like focused campaigns, because somehow in a larger scheme, I'm talking in terms of India. I think if you look at the state, is state really recognizing and is conscious of the great injustice that this unpaid care work is doing on society? So I think there is much more visibilized campaigns, a lot of advertisement, new communication techniques, and then of course felicitations of the role models and those who are doing their part is very important to build that kind of a very concrete, cohesive messages. So I think in a way, if I look at it, as part of the strategy and the learning that we have to get state active. For instance, I will give you an example. Unpaid care work is also, because child care responsibilities are there, it's also care work. Now in India, the biggest problem is that we do not have decent, workable child care facilities near to the communities. And I think state cannot shun away from those responsibilities. So I think these are some of the important aspects that I think needs to be looked at. Apart from that, I think a couple of other things that I would like to kind of talk about is, again, I said it earlier also, but I think our experience tells us that intervention at family level is very important. Family as a unit needs to be looked at. And if one wants to gender norm, you cannot only look at men and boys. The entire family has to be looked at. The other process which we feel is very important is how do you collectivize men who understand the problems of toxic masculinity, who are, we know that men are not monolith. So how do one, collectivize and then raise the voice is something that that is very, very critical, and this is something that needs to be looked at much more seriously and much more effectively. And I think somewhere post-COVID, how do we use technology is also a very important aspect of the way we look at post-COVID work with men and boys, using Facebook chats, Facebook, live streaming, using WhatsApp discussions, and Google Forms, using social media in much more effective way. I think these are some of the things which are very important. But I think if I look at it, I mean, our experience, the way we looked at our work with the men and boys, I can surely say that care work can be a great coping mechanism for men. So it's not that they are doing it because it's a right thing to do. It is right thing to do, but also it is a great help for men, because it also is some way a coping mechanism which they need to look at. I think it also needs to be somewhere when we are talking about this, we need to also look at that as well. And I was also talking about gendered infrastructure, because this is something that I spoke about childcare facilities, but also there are other aspects which is important for if women has to work, then accessible washrooms are there. So as a student of urban planning, and in my previous experience also, I think when city is planned, it is completely planned keeping men in mind. So I think that also needs to come, and we who are working at with men and masculinities also needs to bring state and all those who are into the process of planning infrastructure. Somewhere we need to engage at that level as well, if we want to bring in more women into workforce and also men into care work.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Shrinivas. And what an important reminder about the connections between infrastructure and care work, right? The simple availability of childcare spaces in places where women and men work is so important. So not only availability of those spaces in the infrastructure, but also accessibility and support for those. And what a powerful reminder that care work is good for women and children, but it's also good for men as well in promoting their well-being, in promoting their connections to their children, to their family, and in bringing joy to their lives as well. And that is one of the key discussion points for men and young men in encouraging them to see this issue differently. And of course, your first point of promoting greater value for care work, that's so important in role modeling for new generations, different ways of doing this, because we've all lived so long with these kinds of stereotypes, and also, again, bring this change from the individual to the collective, right? And to take a whole family approach. These are all really great insights. Thank you for sharing those with us. And so now we're going to give the virtual floor to Desmond. So Desmond, welcome back. And so the question for the second round for you is, what is the role of multi-stakeholder networks in driving a collective agenda towards achieving economic justice for women? And if you could describe the power dynamics within intergender activist alliances and share any lessons learned on this front. Make specific reference to the MenEngage Alliance Africa regional network and your work there, if you can.
Thank you very much. I think for us as organizations that work in a network, it is key and important for us to have a collective members within the network. But one key belief that we believe in is that nothing for women without women. So these organizations need to also have organizations that want to work with women, that are women-led, that are part of the network. And it also brings a collective voice, because within the networks, we have faith-based organizations, we have organizations that want to work with men and boys, organizations that work with women, organizations that work on climate change. So it's a diverse group of women, group of organizations that can address issues that affect women. So I think that's the first key point, to say we need to have diversity, we need to have one voice. And because it's important for us to achieve economic justice for women, to challenge certain norms such as policies. And if we have more people that are part of the network, it's easier for us to have a louder voice to be able to address these issues. And so it also helps because it brings a panel of expertise from different settings that can be able to inform the work that we do, and also to help in us structurally developing advocacy campaigns that speak to issues that can be able to help women and children. We've seen also, as the MenEngage network, the importance of accountability, which is one of the key factors that we believe in, for us to be held accountable by the women's movement, to be held accountable for the actions and the work that we are doing, and also besides looking at it as at a level of a network, but tripling down to family, to say we're accountable to the children that are within our families, we're accountable to other men. With the strong belief that this men that abuse women is men that do not do care work, either our fathers, our brothers, or they are our friends within the community. So it's our responsibility as men to be able to call out when we see negative behaviors, to be able to educate and engage them, to be able to take up such work as in care work. But I'd also want to emphasize on the responsibility that is shared by, of course, the government, to ensure that there's certain quotas that are put in place to allow women in workspaces, either for government or for political offices, and also corporate organizations also need to see how they can come up with policies that support women, that support gender equity within the workspaces, and for us within our families, because it starts at home. So let's start educating that boy child to be able to do care work within the household, to be able to help and support their mother, so that when they grow up and they get married, they're not marrying somebody to come and do care work for them, but they're marrying a partner that they want to live and be in love with, and also show that they care by actually doing the care work. But I think it's also important for us to also touch on climate change, especially us here in Africa, because most of the women that mostly work from in informal settings, where these women will probably have to collect firewood, or they probably have to collect mopani worms, or they have to live in farming, where we see a lot of industrialized farming taking place, where men dominate those spaces, and these lands are usually put, a lot of chemicals go into those lands, and at the end they're not able to use that land as women. So I think it's also important for us as organizations and networks that advocate for women to be able to look at these effects of the climate and our soils, and the impact that comes with, and also the industrialization that is happening, that is mostly men-led and profit-led, which then leaves women that are in villages suffering and struggling. So I'll stop there for now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Desmond. Those are really important lessons learned, and in particular, the intersection between climate change and inequities, and the call, your call for us to work on those intersections to make sure that women have equal access to resources and land, and that they don't carry the burden of the environmental impact on local communities and families. And I also really appreciated your call for accountability in this work, for us to be accountable to the women's movement and to women themselves, and to other men too, in men holding each other accountable on these issues, and your call of nothing for women without women. I think that's really important, and it's one of the key pillars of the work to engage men and boys in gender equality, one of the key pillars for the MenEngage Alliance. So thank you for those reminders. And we all have a role to play, right, in addressing this. So it's not just individuals, it's not just civil society, it's government, it's employers, it's corporations, it's all social movements that need to come together to work on transformation. So thank you for sharing those important lessons learned, and thank you for your great work. And so we're going to now invite Nikki to join us again. Hello, Nikki. And the question that we have for you for this second round is, we know that some of the statistics explored earlier are underpinned by restrictive gender norms, which classify women as compassionate caregivers and men as leaders and providers. What are the key lessons learned in engaging men in transforming gender norms within the home as relating to care and household work? And what are the challenges or opportunities that we see in COVID and post-COVID contexts?
Thank you very much, Umberto. Can I pick up on Vaidehi's question about how policymakers can use time surveys before I answer those two questions? Because I don't.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Vaidehi, I just one of my experience with Oxfam was working on a program called We Care, which was about unpaid care in many different ways. And one of the visits I did was to a local council in the Philippines, where Oxfam was working with local councillors and with the local mayor, because I think a lot of this work happens at local level, to look at DHS surveys, the household surveys that every council, every country carries out, and to see whether those could incorporate time use. So I think to your question of whether you can accommodate this aspect of work and labour, I think the answer is yes. It doesn't need to be an entirely new policy process, but it can be one that links research, policy and programming. And I'm happy to answer more about that in the questions later on. I hope that's helpful. So it was a really interesting question, and I've been reflecting on it over the last few days when I've been preparing this, in terms of what the key lessons are in engaging men. I mean, everybody's been picking up a similar thing, that, you know, some of the key lessons are that it's not just about programming or just about redistribution of unpaid care between women and men, though these are really important, but much more broadly about challenging and changing the structures that underpin these norms. And I think Shrinivas said this too, getting the state, getting employers, getting politicians involved, and thinking about care as broadly as the environment as well as the individual. So I was thinking, well, what are the things that, you know, what would the lessons be that I've learned over a number of years of working on unpaid care from different angles? And I kind of came up with 8, but I'm sure that other panelists can add more. And some of these you've picked up on already, really. So ensure that women and women's rights lies at the heart of all the work, for me would be the first one. And in practical terms, what does that mean? That means consulting wives or partners about how to work with men and boys. Again, Shrinivas, I think you talked about that. Starting young, working with girls and boys to instill equality and an ethic of care from an early age. We know that social norms get embedded really, really young. So yeah, almost before babies are born. Be aware that women's and girls' attitudes, as well as men and boys' attitudes, need to change if we're to move this forward. That was 3. The 4th one was grounding fatherhood programs in practical context. So I think a number of people have mentioned this. So around the medical environment in the context of birth. Fatherhood is a key opportunity for positive change, but it can also be a time when you kind of return to more traditional norms because of the pressures of finances, etc., and social norms. Provide positive incentives. Fathers engaged in the men care programs, as Desmond mentioned, need to see the positives of this. In hospitals in Brazil, for example, fathers had health checkups while their wives or partners had antenatal care, an extra encouragement to come along. Number 6 was be aware of wider intersectionalities. There is a danger that work with fathers becomes very binary. So what about LGBTQI parents, for example, but also recognizing that not all men are the same any more than all women are the same. So taking that intersectional lens. Working with decision makers, men and women, to change laws and policies. A number of people have talked about that structural change. And then finally, as Shrinivas pointed out, and I think Amrita in the chat box too, finding ways of valuing care. So a lot of the programming work, it seems to me, to be, around redistribution or reduction, with Diane Nelson's 3 R's, but valuing care, actually, we don't really value care, whether it's paid or unpaid care. So finding ways to value care as a society, as a community, as well as individuals, seems to me to be key to any change. So second question on COVID. Again, people have said a lot of things about COVID. I'm not going to repeat some of them, but just a couple of, you wanted the global north context, so just a few things. So I think care more broadly has been in the public eye during the pandemic as never before. Parents have been at home during lockdowns, for example, which has often been really hard. And I'll come on to the violence piece in a minute. But there has been research in a number of countries, and mainly in the global north, to say that men who've taken on more unpaid care work during COVID say they found a deeper connection with their children and families. So, for example, a couple of studies, one in the United States, where a study of 1,300 American adults, including 300 fathers, found that 68% of those fathers felt closer or much closer to their children since the pandemic. I think men who were at home during lockdown and who engaged positively also realized how much hard work it is if they hadn't been doing it before. In Sweden, a study found that 45% of men said they spent more time with their children during lockdowns, for obvious reasons, but they felt they became better caregivers as a result. And there are a number of other studies like that. We don't know whether this will last. And I haven't yet seen any studies now, kind of as we come out, come out of the pandemic. We need more research, but it is a positive in terms of the sharing between men and women. But we've also talked about the pandemic threatening the gains made to gender equality. Women are more vulnerable to COVID-19 related economic effects. We want to talk about women's economic empowerment because of existing gender inequalities, including the unequal division of unpaid care. And the effects of the pandemic varied hugely by race, class, economic circumstances, and other factors. So research in the US by Oxfam and Promundo in June 2020, so quite early on, found that 71% of Black or African American and Latina women said their daily domestic and care work had increased, 79% of Asian women, but 57% white women. So really being aware of those intersectionalities is so important. Dr. Sipali, you mentioned interpersonal violence. I won't talk about it. It's clearly a huge problem, and I worry that the increase in domestic violence. How do you roll that back? Many countries saw doubling or tripling of the number of calls to helplines. Violence against women is something that has really never gone down, certainly in my lifetime, and it's gone up again. And it's a pandemic of its own kind, and is linked to thinking about the home and the household. Economically, women's jobs, for example, a McKinsey study in the US and India found that women's jobs were 1.8 times more vulnerable than men's during the pandemic, with women from Black and minority ethnic groups most vulnerable, partly due to unpaid care, but also because women had part-time or insecure work and employed in sectors vulnerable in the pandemic, making them more dependent on men, making them more likely to be pushed into poverty. And an analysis by UN Women and UNDP found in 2021 that 435 million women and girls are likely to be living on less than $1.90 a day. And I know it's an imperfect measure, but many had lost their incomes because of the pandemic, and they were less likely than men to be able to access government social protection schemes, all kinds of reasons I won't go into now. And then finally, the pandemic's seen an increase in inequalities and a rise in right-wing populism. Talked about the war in Ukraine, but that's been evidenced from the US to India, Brazil to Hungary, which comes with a backlash against feminism and women's rights. The gender equalities also meant that women's representation was largely absent from COVID-19 responses, or at least much less than men. I don't know if people saw the research by CARE International in 30 countries that found that on average, women made up 24% of national COVID committees. 74% had fewer than 1/3 female membership. And this lack of representation was also found at local level. So as you kind of unpeel that onion, you can just see on every level that there's a real threat that gender equality inequality is boosted and gender equality is rolled back. So to sum up, for me, what's clear about looking at unpaid care, social norm change, We are in real danger of regressing on many things after the pandemic. And if we're to succeed, we've seen that change must be personal and structural, intersectional and connected and accountable. I think the pandemic, and indeed this Commission on the Status of Women, has seen feminists and those working with men on gender equality, climate change activists and those working in the Black Lives Matter movement come together to show the indivisibility of inequalities, as well as the vital importance of solidarity, the powerful need to listen to the powerless, the global north to the global south, white people to people of colour, and men to women, among others. If we want that change, we need to have a whole reshaping of the contours of our world. So the global north no longer dominates the global south, war is prevented before it starts, and climate change ceases to devastate the planet, and gender equality is finally achieved. And I'm just hoping that webinars like these ones will help to move that forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nikki. Inspiring words and calls to action indeed. And so compassion, empathy, solidarity, equity, and transformation is a lot of what is needed in addressing these issues. And I'm hopeful in what you shared too. We often hear about the horrible consequences and impacts, disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 on women and children and vulnerable communities. But the research that you shared, that the men who've been able to participate in healthy ways in home responsibilities and in giving care while working from home have enjoyed and formed deeper connections with their children is really inspiring and really motivating, and perhaps a call to action on all men to live differently and to find ways to have more meaningful connections and to participate more equally in more supportive ways in their home life. And so thank you for sharing those 8 lessons learned, which were so good and impactful. You know, the use of fatherhood as an entry point for transformation, the women's, that we must not forget the women's that women's rights and equity and change and transformation lie at the heart of this issue, and to also work with women and girls to change the stereotypical expectations and norms that they too have grown up with and have experienced pressure to conform to as a result of patriarchy. But most importantly, we need to change that around for men and boys. So thank you for those insights. And now we're going to turn it over to Shrinivas. But before we do that, just a reminder and an invitation to our audience members to share your thoughts and your questions in the chat box. After Shrinivas' intervention, we'll have an opportunity to take up those questions and to engage in a more informal discussion. So please do share your thoughts there. And so Shrinivas, welcome again. And so I'm sorry, it's not Shrinivas, it's Dr. Sapali. My apologies. Dr. Sapali, what are your thoughts on some of the main insights we've gathered today? How can our program interventions be tailored in a way that would drive tangible results in both policy and practice?
Thank you. Yeah, I think we have covered quite a number of very significant issues and the kind of interventions that we need to be pushing for. One of the things that, for example, Desmond said was that to bring in a panel of experts from different sectors. These experts that are informed and aware of the need to change the balance or the lack of balance between the persons who are engaged in unpaid care work and those who aren't, and those challenges that are there that we need to address because of the differential power distribution among women and men. And I think also one of the other things in terms of policy, which I want to bring in here, is we need to look at the way in which national budgets actually are formed and on what informs national budgets. For example, if we look at the kind of investments that local government bodies do, the provincial government bodies do in our country and in many countries on care facilities. Are we investing enough? We are not investing enough on care facilities. And then are there care facilities on site where women work or where men work, are employed, for example, in the formal sector? Are there care facilities closer to residences of these families so that women or men can leave their children in a safe and reliable facility for them to be able to engage in formal or informal sector work? And I think the challenge is, as Nikki also pointed out, it's getting women and girls also to recognize that they are not the only people responsible for the welfare of the family members, because we know that most often women and girls are brought up to accept these roles. Women perform these roles on the basis that they are the ones who must take up these responsibilities. We need to change. The attitudinal change has to be from the childhood upwards. And I think another point that came up was the very low representation of women in COVID response programs. I think it probably was universal. Certainly in South Asia, in Sri Lanka, it was, that there were hardly any women to talk about what the impact was having, COVID was having, the pandemic was having on their lives, on the lives of the family members, on the role and the increased burden of care work within the home. So this should be a platform for us to move forward in terms of recognizing how we should be addressing this, that we should be addressing this issue. And I think also the Amrita's comments on the chat box about the low value given to care work, whether it's within the home, and as I pointed out, because we have an entire social and economic system that does not recognize or value the work that is the unpaid care work that is done in the home. It also is reflected in the low wages and salaries that people, and mostly women, who are involved in care work professionally or in the formal sector. So recognizing and addressing the disparities and I would say the unreasonable burdening of women with care work has to take in many approaches. And I feel that in a way, it's almost like we need to rewire policy, because we are speaking to kind of I sometimes feel like it's like we are speaking to a wall, because we need to change so much in so many ways. It's at the interpersonal level, as Nikki pointed out. It's attitudinal, it's with women and men. It's to make girls and boys aware of the need to have that balance in responsibilities, and it is in terms of policy. So we don't have, for example, here, but we have paternity leave, which is 2 or 3 days, which is meaningless. We need to have paternity leave because it's a necessity for sharing care work, not because it's to meet some UN requirement for recognizing unpaid care work, and then giving three days, you know. So it is something that needs to be done with the expression of commitment to have meaningful policy that is going to reflect in changes in this distribution of unpaid care work, and in recognizing the value of unpaid care work. So I will want to end with that, and if it's possible, Rinushi, to show the video clip.
අනේ කවද්ද? අද උදේ. ගොඩක් අමාරුද? අනේ ඔයාට ඇවිත් යන්න බැරිද? ඒ වුණාට දෙතේ නෑ.
ඕකේ.
අපේ අම්මා වෙටලා පුස්සේ.
මල කෙලිය. ඉතින්
පංගෙන් එන්නද?
තෝ ළමයි දෙන්න. කොලකෝ.
එයාට නිින්ද ගියා. මෙයා කොහෙද ඉන්නේ? මේ කිරිපිටි සීන්ටික මෙතන. හරිද? හාල් පොල් ටික මෙතන. බබාගේ කිරි බෝතල් සේරම අතන තියෙනවා. එළවලු ටික ෆ්‍රිජ් එකේ. සතියම වගේ අල්ලන් ටික පුළුවන් ද නේ වට තනියම?
ඕවතර දාලු. ඕව සුළු දේවල්.
උදේ 10ට හවස 3ට මෙයාට කිරි දෙන්න ඕන. සමහර විට මට එන්නත් පුළුවන් වෙයි.
හරි හරි ඔයා ගිහලා ඉක්මනට එන්නකෝ.
තාත්තේ
හලෝ.
මොකද කරන්නේ?
වැඩ හලෝ. දැන් මොකද?
මට දෙන්න වෙන්නේ නේ.
අප්පඩ්සේ.
අපි හැමදාම ඒක කරනවා. තේරුණාද?
අම්මෝ තේරුණා. හොඳටම තේරුණා.
කොහොමද රුදින්?
නිකි. මානසිකද?
කාටද?
මම වටේ එකක් හදාගෙන ඉන්නද?
So I'll end on that hopeful note.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sapali, for your insights and for that great video, which seems to turn the tables and show us how things could be, although it seems that particular father and dad could use with some more practice, and so that's clear. So thank you for that review of the challenges that you saw reflected during our various interventions, and your reminders that we must continue to advocate for policy change. This is not just about individual change, although that is an important driver, individual and attitudinal change, but also family practices and norms, because so much of what we do as individuals is also informed, valued, or imposed oftentimes by our extended family members. So the point that was made earlier that we must use a whole family approach is really good, and also that again, to reiterate that policy change at the government, at the employer, at the community level, cultural practice changes is part of the solution as well. So that speaks to the need for broader structural changes. So those disparities, including unequal pay, can be addressed as well. All right, so now we will move on to the question and answer discussion phase. And so there have been some comments included in the chat box, and I'll quickly go through them, and then perhaps I will give the panelists an opportunity to respond as they wish. So Amrita mentioned that today care work is considered unskilled and hence underpaid space, mostly occupied by women as household help, medical care workers, frontline health workers, making care work more economically viable, creating a care work economy, investing in care infrastructure might be one of the key policy pushes that should be considered. Samita mentioned that caring for earth and environment has also become a responsibility for women, since it's so much linked to the care work at home, and Desmond's example of women's role in gathering firewood, for example, is an illustration of that, and so many other responsibilities that women carry in this area. Satish made the point that men and boys are engaged in care work need to be facilitated so associated social norms can be challenged and changed. And Steffi shared her appreciation for the panelists and for the rich insight contributions in this topic. It's been fantastic to listen to solutions and suggestions for change, not just problems. I've really enjoyed being able to hear voices from across the world and different perspectives, being able to identify our common problems and acknowledging that we can work together to find solutions for them. I believe dialogue like this is such an important starting point, great points around education, going beyond policy and programming and starting discussions and actions towards systemic change. One point that will stay with me is about attitudes and values placed towards care, paid and unpaid. So absolutely, as the points have been made earlier, we must look at care work as valuable, as deserving of resources, of equal treatment, and transformation, much needed transformation. So I'm going to turn it over to the panelists and give them another quick opportunity to respond to some of these comments. Perhaps they want to pick up on any of them in particular, or share any points that perhaps they didn't have a chance to share beforehand. And so I'll quickly turn it over to maybe in 2 minutes maximum. Nikki, starting with you. Any further insights or responses to the comments that have been shared in the chat box?
Yeah, I'm just reflecting. I think it's just been such a rich discussion. I really appreciate all the other panelists and also the participants, the kind of comments that have been coming in. I've learned a lot as well, really. And I don't think we would have had this conversation 5 years ago. I think that's also interesting to me, that I guess I've been working on unpaid care for quite a long time, and it's definitely moved from thinking about programming, building on the work that lots of organizations have been doing, I guess, Desmond, Shrinivas, many others, thinking about how you can get men more involved in the home, to, yeah, that's a good start. It makes a big difference. It's not always easy for the men. They get a lot of pushback from other men. But it's not enough. And then I think we move to thinking about social norm change, and therefore you need to think more broadly, and it's not just about changing the men, it's the communities. And now I do think in the last couple of years, it's been really interesting that we're thinking more broadly, both about care, in terms of lots of people have mentioned, care for the environment as well as care for ourselves, and valuing that care, and in terms of the structural changes that we need. So I guess for me now, I'm just trying to get my head around how we bring all that together, and how we still try and address that issue around valuing care that keeps coming up. Because actually, if men started doing paid care jobs, it probably would be more valued. That's what's happened in the past. Look at, male chefs. Women cook all the time. Men who become chefs are wonderful, they're fantastic. So how do we value care without, getting men to do it? I know my son-in-law was taking my grandson to the cafe, and he said, oh, and all the women were saying, oh, aren't you wonderful? You're taking your child to the cafe. You're thinking, if it was a woman, nobody would say that. So it's a complicated issue. It's a really important issue, and I'm really glad we're having this conversation. So, to be continued.
To be continued, indeed. Nikki, thank you so much for those insights. And yeah, in thinking about how we even value paid care work and the inequities that exist in terms of work that's performed by women and paid, and versus work that is performed by men, and in particular in professional areas, for example, healthcare, and the differences in pay gaps between what women doctors, for example, earn versus male doctors and specialists, and not to mention access to those careers for women, and then the inequities that exist in there too. So something to consider as well. Dr. Sapali, what further insights or further lessons can you share with us?
I think putting a value on unpaid care work is really, really important, because it is just assumed that women do it and therefore it is not of any value. And just to something that I forgot to say earlier, the Sri Lanka Department of Census and Statistics did a time use survey for the first time. And this first time is very much linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, recognizing unpaid care work, right? And they found 59.7% of men do housework compared to 87.3 women. Now, my organization also did a time use survey and on research on unpaid care work in 6 districts in Sri Lanka. And our analysis found that men actually spend 5.9 hours on housework and women 9.14. So you can see we need to bring this kind of data up, and it has to be upfront, in your face, and then we say, is this what we call development? And clearly the SDGs are saying, has put this in as a concern, and it's something that governments must address. So yeah, it has to be strategic, and it is long term. And I think all of us here are committed for that long haul. So that's what I'd like to say. And I did put in the chat box that my organization is organizing a conference on unpaid care work in South Asia. So please, anybody is welcome to send an abstract, and we would be delighted to look at those. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you make a good point that these changes take time, but I think we're all impatient as well. We want to see transformation happen and happen soon. So I think one of the questions that we need to ask or pose is, how can we do this quickly at a scale that will bring it about quick change and transformation, so that we're not waiting for decades longer before we see a turn on these issues. So Desmond, what are your thoughts on this? And maybe you can address that question. How can we accelerate this kind of change? And what stands in the way perhaps of doing that?
Well, thank you very much. I think a lot of colleagues have echoed the urgency when it comes to these issues. And for me, I think how we can accelerate is ensuring that we're able to work with young men, to work with children. I always say that it will take our generation to sacrifice our comfort zone if we, whenever given an opportunity to learn how to cook, to clean the house, to take care of the kids, we need to start learning how to do that so that our sons can be able to learn from us. And we also need to be very mindful of not only trying to rush to seeing these changes by embracing some approaches that might necessarily also cause more harm than good. An example that one of our local clinics did was to say, if men are bringing their kids for antenatal care, they can jump the line and be able to be served first. And this also didn't turn out all right for women, because they thought they were spending the whole day in queues and men were just coming and jumping the queue. So for us to be sensitive to say, as we try and accelerate this, let's ensure that we are not also offending or overwriting our rights and taking out women's rights to also have equal opportunities and respect of their time. So I think it's good that the will is moving, but we all want to accelerate. We all want to see more change, but it needs to be internal. We need to be the message that we give to the people. So it needs to start with us, and we also in our programming needs to reach to hard to reach areas in our communities. Let's not only have programs in cities, let's have programs in villages where some of this is really needed. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Change starts with us, in fact, and yes, with the present generation and the younger generation, and there's the opportunity, as our panelists shared with us before, to role model our alternatives for the young people in our lives, especially for boys and young men who are looking up to us for good examples of how to grow into adult men as well. And yeah, so do no harm is an important principle. Be aware of unintended consequences, and you gave a really great example of what can happen and how harmful that can be. Shrinivas, your thoughts on all of this?
So I was just thinking, I mean, what Nikki has said, and even Sepali has said, I think I think what we also need to look at is, I would look at a non-traditional livelihoods for women and non-traditional livelihoods for men, and they need to go hand in hand. So when we say more women technocrats, more women getting into become bus drivers. I mean, I'm talking about in Indian context as well, plumbers, electricians, and getting into the jobs which are traditionally being there for men, and men getting into the non-traditional livelihoods such as being caregivers, being into become nurses, being childcare, working in the childcare facilities. I think that is the balance that would bring it more peace and harmony. So I think it's time for looking at non-traditional ways of engaging in livelihoods. That's where we will look forward for this kind of better world, I would say.
Absolutely. Great point. Desmond, go for it.
I just wanted, I forgot to respond to the question that came out where we say, how can we engage with companies and corporates to ensure that they create centers and policies that allow men as caregivers. And I was saying it's important, like your question was saying, a multi-sectoral approach for us to even work with workers' unions, because they are some of the people that are able to put pressure on companies and government to be able to change policies that would then be able to help when it comes to care work. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Desmond. Nikki and Dr. Sapali, a question for you around accountability, and how can we ensure, and because accountability has been brought up several times now, how can we ensure that our programs and approaches and advocacy are accountable to women's movements and don't lose sight of that end goal of promoting gender equality and equity for women and girls? Dr. Sapali?
I would think here, I think here in terms of economic planning, in terms of looking at labor force participation, in terms of saying we have to have more women in the labor force. You know, the issues of accountability come in terms of what are the provisions that are being made, what are the investments in these provisions that are being made to enable women to come into the labor force. So you see, I think we have had some comments here on definitions of work, because obviously housework is not considered to be work enough of value to be included in the labor force. So we do have that discussion. But just to say that, how is the state going to be accountable to women to come in and to be involved in paid work, and how is it going to be accountable to ensure that men are facilitated to take up to engage in care work in their homes? And that needs to be, I think, something that we need to push.
Thank you so much. And how about you, Nikki? How do we incorporate greater accountability into these practices?
Good question, and you can probably answer this as well too, I think, Umberto, in the sense that for me, the work that MenEngage Alliance has done on accountability principles is really groundbreaking. I haven't got a link to the website, maybe somebody else can put it up, but there are some accountability principles and guidelines that the MenEngage Alliance has been developing in conjunction with feminist organizations that I think are really, really good. And I think MenEngage has put them into practice. I don't know if people have participated in the MenEngage Ubuntu Symposium, but there were fantastic feminist speakers there that I thought it was a really good example in practice of how you're accountable. If you're thinking about unpaid care more specifically, I mean, in some ways, it's an easier one to answer on accountability because feminists have been leading the way on this for the last 20 years. So actually, organizations with working with men on gender equality just have to follow that work. We've mentioned Diane Nelson's work a number of times. So, listening to what feminist economists have to say, and there's lots of them around all over the world. It's not one of those things which is dominated by the global north in any sense. There have been lots of discussions, and it's about men joining those conversations now, not dominating them, but joining them in the way that we've been doing today. So I'm hoping today that we've been modeling that accountability as well.
Thank you so much, Nikki. And indeed, MenEngage Alliance has this question at the heart of its work, because we want to make sure that we do call for change in solidarity in support of building on the decades old, centuries old now, work of the women's movement and the diverse feminist movements and social movements. We're not alone in this. We must not overtake. We must support, stand side by side, and call on greater accountability from men as well. So thank you for sharing those thoughts. I want to share another comment that was included in the chat box from Hari. Young men and boys have a role to encourage a more equal distribution of unpaid care work at the family level. Strategies to address unpaid care work at the community level are needed to promote effective change in attitudes towards unpaid care work. So again, making the point that this is as much about policy change, about community, attitudinal shifts, and individual shifts as well, and not losing sight of the role that the family as a whole plays in all of this. I want to go into intersectionality, and Nikki, you mentioned this as well in your comments about the need to accept the diversity in men's roles and identities and family makeups and so forth. And I want to ask all of you, how do you incorporate intersectionality into your work? And let's start quickly, just 30 seconds, because we're almost at time. 30 seconds from Shrinivas.
I think, intersectionality is, if you look at work that we do at every level, if you look at the social, economic intersectionalities of caste in Indian context, the class, the religion, the gender preferences, sexual preferences, these needs to be somewhere, first is the recognition of it is equally important, how sensitive one needs to be. I think it's the value that needs to come in. I think that's what is important, and it is also about practice. How one has to practice it, then only one is able to build a larger coalition. So in our context, I can say it is the most important aspect of any reform work that we want to do. If we don't recognize differences, but also intersectionality, then it will be very difficult to meet the challenges that we have in front of us. I think it's very important. But most importantly, it has to be looked at, recognized, and valued. That's the way.
Thank you so much, Shrinivas. Desmond, quick 30 seconds. How do you incorporate intersectionality into your work?
I think for us, it's similar. We ensure that we have different diverse groups of people that are part of the MenEngage network. And we ensure that within our programming, it's not only targeted at certain individuals, but we ensure that there is also rotation of leadership within our spaces, in our communities, in our steering committees. And we ensure that we're leaving no one behind, because one way or the other, if we need meaningful change and meaningful transformation, there is need for us to engage with everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you. Dr. Sapali, how about you?
I think one of the ways in which we address this is to put forward the concept of the family. There is, the diversities of families, and to recognize that there is no universal structure of family. And families can be single mothers, single fathers, same-sex partners, and also to bring in the ethnic and religious diversities that are there in our country, and pull these together in terms of looking at the issues of women's rights, of gender equality.
Thank you very much. Very inspiring. Nikki, finally to you.
Really difficult in 30 seconds. I think in this context, just picking up on what Dr. Sapali is saying, there is often an assumption that a family is nuclear, and that was very clear that in the Breakthrough film that there were lots of other people around as well, and B, heterosexual. So questioning that the whole time, in the same way that as a feminist, I'm always saying you're assuming that this is for men. In terms of unpaid care, we can't assume that there's a husband and a wife in a family. Families are terribly diverse, and we need to really take account of that. That's more I could say, but I'll stop.
Wonderful. I think that's a great point. So thank you so much for that, and absolutely looking at the diversity of lives, of experiences, of identities as we work through these issues is so important, and also the need for us to join efforts with diverse social justice movements and feminist movements as well. So fantastic. Well, thank you so much to the four of you, Desmond, Nikki, Dr. Sapali, Shrinivas. It's been a pleasure having this conversation with you. Thank you for the important life-changing work that you do, for your important advocacy and the transformation programs that you're leading, and the research that you're conducting, and your support in helping our movements move forward towards a more equal, more equitable future and world and present time when it comes to recognizing and carrying out care work. It's of benefit to all of us. Care work is a matter of gender equality, and gender equality is of benefit to everyone. So thank you for that important work. It's clear that much more needs to be done. That work needs to be done at the individual, at the family, at the community, collective, and at the systemic level as well. We need to work not just in terms of changing attitudes and individual behaviors and thinking, but also in changing our systems, our cultures, our policies, and our structures, so that we can address this in a transformative and equitable way. There have been so many examples, lessons learned, and words of caution as well, but also inspiring examples of change. I think we need to move forward with those stories in mind, that change is possible and it is happening. And as much as possible, we need to collect those examples of change as well and share it with our audiences, with our families, with our individual groups, with our policymakers, in order to inspire and motivate further change, because change is possible and it's needed, and this needs to be accelerated, of course. And we must not forget the intersections between the global pandemic, which also exacerbate the problem, and war and conflict, which makes it all so much more difficult, and also climate and the environment and its intersections and impact on care work as well. So on behalf of Breakthrough India, of Azad Foundation, and the MenEngage Alliance in South Asia, our sincere gratitude again to our panelists, to our audience for participating and for sharing this time with us, and to the organizers, to Renushi, to Samita, Urvashi, to Shrinivas, and everybody that's been a part of organizing this event. Our thanks, and we'll see you all again, and my very best wishes to all of you, and enjoy the rest of CSW66. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your moderation. Umberto, that's great. And
Yes,
thank you for
thanks.
inviting us all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.